Hi, and welcome again to Ivy English. I'm Karen.
And I'm Chris Gorski.
Today is December 15th, and we're on page 44 in your magazines. Today we're going to hear part one of a two-part piece about a very, very famous book, which has actually had a lot of influence on a lot of people.
Yeah, we're talking about The Catcher in the Rye, which, as a book I enjoy, it's not a title I enjoy. Even to this very day, I think I know what the book title is about, but at the same time, I'm still never really quite sure. It's just one of those titles that never really caught me, but I love the book nonetheless.
The title comes from a children's rhyme. There's a 4-line children's rhyme in the book that tells you where the title is from, and I don't remember the rhyme, but if you look it up, you can find it. One line is The Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah,
it's
he
totally
tells
from a
the
children's
story,
rhyme.
and yeah, but to me, why this is the symbol of the story, that never made sense to me. But nonetheless, it's a book I enjoy.
Okay, let's go to our article. All right, our title again is the title of the book, The Catcher in the Rye. And rye, by the way, is a kind of grain. It's sort of like wheat, but it's larger and it's darker. It's what they have traditionally eaten in Northern Europe. So in Northern Europe, you almost never had white flour. You had rye flour.
Do you like rye bread?
I don't eat bread.
I love rye bread.
I like it, but it makes me fat. At this age, I can't eat starch. But yeah, it's very tasty. And it's not as sticky as white flour. So anyway, The Catcher in the Rye is a kind of grain. Holden Caulfield recounts his story from a hospital where he has been sent to receive therapy and rest following a mental breakdown. His story relates how he was expelled from Pensy Prep, a boarding school in Pennsylvania.
He explains that he was obliged to leave the school after failing 4 of his 5 classes and having only managed to receive a passing grade in English. Shortly before Christmas break, he was told that he could not return to campus for the upcoming semester. After hearing the news, he returned to his dorm and became upset when he heard that his roommate, Stradlater, would be going on a date with Jane Gallagher, a girl whom Holden used to date. This prompted Holden to attack him, but Stradlater was able to defend himself and break Holden's nose in the process.
After this incident, Holden decided to return to his hometown of Manhattan early. However, instead of going home, he opted to check into the Edmond Hotel and stay on his own for a few days. Alone in the city, Holden wandered around seeking human interaction. He visited a jazz club, but suddenly left after running into his older brother's ex-girlfriend. After that, he reminisced about Jane Gallagher and even attempted to call her several times, but couldn't reach her. Instead, Holden decided to get in touch with Sally, another former girlfriend, and made plans to attend a Broadway show with her. While on their date, he suggested that they run away together, but she refused, which enraged Holden. Disillusioned, he then contacted and visited an old English professor, but left in the middle of the night after suffering an unwanted sexual advance. He then spent the night on a bench at Grand Central Station. Wow, so a lot of things are happening to him that probably contributed to his falling apart. Let's go back to the beginning. Holden Caulfield recounts his story from a hospital where he has been sent to receive therapy and rest following a mental breakdown. To have a mental breakdown, that means that you become mentally, emotionally unstable. You are too sick to take good care of yourself.
So he's recounting his story. So we know right away this entire story should be in the past tense. But there are a few moments in the story where he's going to use the simple present tense for dramatic effect. We'll talk about them later, probably tomorrow. But when you see this story, you are going to see mountains of passive voice. This is just how Holden talks, a lot like a teenager. And it's all in the past tense.
A lot like a teenager. And a lot of people actively copied the way he spoke, and they spoke even more like teenagers from the 50s or so. Next sentence, his story relates how he was expelled from Pensy Prep, a boarding school in Pennsylvania. Prep is short for a preparatory school. These are usually private, very, very expensive. They're for people from very rich families, and it prepares you to go to a place like Yale or Harvard.
This is a great point because when we examine Holden's personality, we're going to understand that he really, really does not like commercialism. He has a problem with people being fake. He'll call them phonies. Today we would call it fake. And he has a real problem with kind of commercialism in general. We're going to learn how this is compounded in the next paragraph.
If you have trouble with commercialism, you're going to have a hard time surviving in the U.S.
And especially where he lives in the U.S.
Advertising everywhere. It used to drive me nuts every time I went back. So to relate means to tell. His story tells how, relates how. To be expelled means to be kicked out. He was in the school, but they removed him from the school for, I would say, a very good reason. And he was not happy there. There's no point in staying there. It's very expensive anyway. Second paragraph.
He explains that he was obliged to leave the school after failing 4 of his 5 classes and having only managed to receive a passing grade in English.
That one kind of made me laugh because the one thing he can do is use language well. He wrote his book, after all. So that's the one class where he did well.
Yeah, when we manage to do something, we're doing it, but we don't do it easily, which is unusual because he is actually asked by some of his friends to help write their paragraphs for him. He is actually quite competent at it. Holden just doesn't care.
And he doesn't want to do the work. And I'm sure this happens to a lot of people. Honestly, as a professor at Taiwan University, I watched this happen with quite a few students. Many of them eventually just dropped out. And then 2 years later, they were back. They'd sort of thought about it and decided they want to finish their studies after all.
Let's continue. Shortly before Christmas break, he was told he could not return to campus for the upcoming semester.
So this was around Christmas time. That means around the time that the first semester is ending. And right around then, his teachers and the administrators from the university were probably telling him, or the school rather, were telling him that you're doing really lousy. You cannot come back. It's no point keeping you here. You have to go.
This also colors the way you should be viewing this novel. This is a cold, snowy time for much of the Northeast. When he's out walking around New York, it's not summer. This is a cold time of the year.
It's a pretty nasty and slushy time.
Yeah,
when I think
slushy.
of winter in New York, it's slush. It's dirty snow.
Let's continue. After hearing the news, he returned to his dorm and became upset when he heard that his roommate, Stradlater, would be going on a date with Jane Gallagher, a girl whom Holden used to date.
This is interesting because sometimes when you think of people that you dated in the past, you don't have any special feeling. However, if somebody else is dating that person, it might make you really mad.
In weird ways, it's almost like cheating. Holden has an issue with kind of possessing people and owning them. We talked earlier that he loved the passive voice. Another word that you're going to read so much in this book is sort of. He has a problem with kind of expressing his feelings. He uses passive voice because he keeps people away. He has a hard time expressing his feelings clearly. And he also uses this sort of to also create distance between people. He says sort of 179 times in this book. And he describes Stradlater as sort of a nasty guy. This is not a person he actually likes, even though they're roommates.
And as I understand, he never had a real relationship with a girl.
Yeah.
Like he tried to date, but it did not work out. They broke up very quickly. He never had sex with them. And so actually later on when Stradlater was with Jane Gallagher, they did have sex. And that really pissed him off.
Holden is, we would call him an incel today, I-N-C-E-L.
Yeah.
This is a person that maybe wanted to have like sex and relationship with girls, but he's just too awkward and weird to make it happen.
Right. And that really pisses him off when somebody else can do it when he couldn't.
This next sentence begins, this prompted Holden to attack him, but Stradlater was able to defend himself and break Holden's nose in the process.
That is pretty wild. So first of all, he's got a lot of guts to try and attack another guy. I mean, you don't know how strong they are. So he attacks him. That's how angry he is. He's probably not thinking straight. Then Stradlater, he fights back, and obviously he's much stronger, and Holden gets his nose broken, and that's a pretty serious injury to recover from.
And that's the key word here. I was just thinking this is very much to add insult to injury. Mm-hmm. So Holden is mad that this guy is dating, quote unquote, his girlfriend, or at least his ex-girlfriend that he thinks he has a good relationship with. Then he tries to fight Stradlater. Stradlater's a stronger guy and just beats him up.
So I would say it's adding injury to insult in this case. It goes the other way around. All right, next paragraph, last paragraph. After this incident, Holden decided to return to his hometown of Manhattan early. All right, so he had this awful experience. His nose is broken. After this, he goes back home in Manhattan. That is like the busiest part of New York City.
And we spoke earlier that Holden hates phonies. He hates fakes and crumb bums. He hates people that are not honest. They don't live an integral life. He does not like commercialism and all this pretending to be something that you're not. But he goes to a prep school and he lives in Manhattan. His very existence is surrounded by these very things he hates.
We call that conformity. He hates conformity. That's C-O-N-F-O-R-M-I-T-Y. C-O-N-F-O-R-M-I-T-Y. Con means together with, form means the shape of something. So you get together with other people in the same shape. And that was really big in the age when I grew up in the 60s. People did not like conformity. But then everybody dressed in the same way with ragged jeans and long hair. I mean, that was really the ultimate of conformity.
It was your uniform, your non-conformity uniform.
And everybody conformed to it. If you didn't conform to it, you get criticized. Like a friend said, look how short his hair is. Well, you didn't have the choice of having short hair back then if you're a guy.
That's a very good point. It's you're the non-conformist uniform.
Yeah, so they were actually very intolerant. Well, anyway, he hated conformity. However, instead of going home, he opted to check into the Edmont Hotel and stay on his own for a few days.
Ooh la la.
So he didn't go straight home. I don't know where he got the money, but he stayed at this hotel for a few days. Opted to means decided to. He made this choice.
Don't forget when we say instead of, that means that after instead of, that's the thing we didn't do. In fact, I always make my students underline instead of, draw an arrow to the thing after it and say didn't do.
That will help you keep it straight. Alone in the city, Holden wandered around seeking human interaction. Now, that's what we humans do. Whenever we don't have anything urgent to do, there's nothing kind of on our to-do list, we get lonely really fast. So he's wandering around the city. He wants to interact with some other person.
He'll talk to anybody. And many times he's so frustrated by his inability to either connect with a person honestly, or he feels that they're hiding from him. But this kind of makes sense. Here you got this weird, desperate teenager with a broken nose running around in a red hunting cap. This red hunting cap is very famous. But even in the 1940s in New York City, why are you wearing a hunting cap? Holden was just a weird dude and couldn't understand why people wouldn't connect with him genuinely. He would try to have these deep conversations with taxi drivers, and they're like, kid, man, I'm just driving you around.
Yeah. I mean, this is not my thing. Leave me alone. We would say now that he was socially awkward.
He was definitely an awkward person.
Socially awkward and doing a lot of socially inappropriate things. And we really try to distance ourselves from anybody like that. He visited a jazz club, but suddenly left after running into his older brother's ex-girlfriend. He didn't want to meet anybody in his family or anybody who knew anybody in his family because they would tell his family that he was back in New York, and he did not want to go home right then.
Jazz clubs in the 1940s also were kind of a unsavory place. It was considered very adult, even in some ways a little bit bad. It was think of like a club where you'd be able to buy drugs or something. It was that kind of a feeling.
Yeah, smoking, drinking, drugs, criminal activity. It was all there. All right, next sentence. After that, he reminisced about Jane Gallagher and even attempted to call her several times, but couldn't reach her. Now, as mentioned earlier, they had never had sex. It was never a real relationship. He asked her out. Things did not go well. They stopped seeing each other. She did not want to see him.
When we say to reminisce, that means we're thinking or remember something, but especially you're remembering it fondly. You don't reminisce about the bad times. You reminisce about the good times.
Or times that you imagine as having been good, but maybe they were not that good in the first place. And that was the case here. Instead, Holden decided to get in touch with Sally, another former girlfriend, and made plans to attend a Broadway show with her. So he thought of somebody else that he dated after Jane. And then he did go out with Sally, but that did not go well either.
So I drew my arrow back up to the sentence that has, however, instead of going home. And remember, after instead of, we don't do that thing. When we say instead, we do in fact do this thing. So, right, did do it after instead.
Okay, our next sentence. While on their date, he suggested that they run away together, but she refused, which enraged Holden. Now, they were not close. It was not what I would call a successful relationship in the first place. But now he is so desperate for human closeness. He wants to have a relationship, wants to have sex, he wants security, wants all these things, but Sally is not interested.
So I think he meets this girl that they used to date. They broke up, haven't seen each other in a while. Would you run away with me? No, doesn't that seem a little bit strange? And then he goes crazy. So we see that Holden has issues with anger and kind of fitting in and being normal. No surprise that he's having trouble with the girls.
I would say he's off his rocker.
Yeah, there's so many good phrases today.
There are a lot of good phrases. A rocker is a rocking chair. And then to be off of it, that means you fell off of the rocking chair. You're probably rocking too hard and then you were not stable. So off your rocker means that you are not well mentally. Disillusioned, he then contacted and visited an old English professor, but left in the middle of the night after suffering an unwanted sexual advance. I guess it was a homosexual sexual advance.
So, yeah, he was a guy. In the story, he spends the night at the professor's house, and when Holden is sleeping, the professor goes to his room and just kind of rubs his forehead. In the story, it is not clear that this was a sexual advance, and this is kind of a problem because we know Holden is not a reliable narrator. We know that he doesn't see things accurately. We know he doesn't have a clear sense of what's really happening. So it's not clear whether this guy is a homosexual. Holden thinks he is, but it's also at the same time really not clear about what's happening. But there is still kind of a weird boundary crossed when your professor lets you stay the night and he walks into your room and starts rubbing your face.
It's very, very suspicious.
Suspicious, but I would say not definite, although it's probably better that Holden does leave.
I think what usually happens is he's testing the waters. He wants to see the other person's reaction. If they push him away, then maybe he'll back off. If he doesn't, then maybe he's got a chance. But Holden was not gay. Whatever else he was not gay. And this did not interest him. And I also read something recently where something similar happened. A woman was in an elevator and another guy got in at the same floor. And the guy says to this woman, you look kind of tired. Are you well? And then he said, let me feel your forehead. And then she beats him. I mean, really hard.
It's like, why are you touching me? Yeah, don't touch me, weirdo.
That was inappropriate. She wrote an article about it. That's how I know about it. So usually when somebody who doesn't know you is a complete stranger, there is something definitely socially inappropriate and wrong about that. You have crossed a boundary, and that's what happened here. Okay, our last sentence. He then spent the night on a bench at Grand Central Station. And now, at the time, it was bad enough. But any time that you choose to sleep in any public place, especially like a train station, an airport is better because they're better managed. But especially if it's a bus station or a train station, that's usually where a lot of drunks and druggies and runaways stay.
And this is wintertime. It's cold in New York, and he's sleeping in a train station. It's a tough time for Holden.
It's cold. It's dangerous. And there he was because he kind of lost his last chance to find someone to stay with. The two girls didn't work out. The English professor didn't work out. And here he is. What is he going to do?
So before we wrap up for today, we need to talk about our author, J.D. Salinger. J.D. Salinger, as we said earlier, was one of the best-selling authors of his time. This is the best-selling book that was never made into a movie. And it's also one of the last books that J.D. Salinger wrote. He hated fame. He hated the idea of being famous and giving interviews. He never did it. The first two editions of this book actually had a big picture. J.D. Salinger, I wouldn't say was a super handsome guy, but he wasn't ugly either. And he hated that his picture was on the book. It's like, that's not important. I don't want pictures on my book. I want just the name of the book, and that's the only thing I want. And so he forced them to remove that book, and he says, I will not do any business with you if you keep my picture and you have any other pictures on this. And in fact, the version of The Catcher in the Rye that you're most likely to see has a plain white cover with just the words The Catcher in the Rye. After he died, publishers kind of said, well, he's dead, so we don't care anymore. And they would add pictures to it. But if you really want the spirit of The Catcher in the Rye, get that plain white cover book.
That's it. Okay, we're going to have to stop here, but we're going to continue our article on The Catcher in the Rye tomorrow. Make sure you tune in then. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.